Okay, imagine something absolutely essential, like fundamental to life, something maybe we even use every day, but then imagine that a sudden glut of it, or even just bringing back its partner water, could actually be deadly. Sounds completely backward, doesn't it? We're talking about salt. Today we're doing a deep dive into salt poisoning. You might also hear it called sodium ion toxicosis, or sometimes water deprivation, sodium ion intoxication. We've gathered insights from some really comprehensive reports like salt poisoning in Camelidae and Cervidae, and another called salt toxicosis, camelid vulnerability and cervid environmental risk. Our goal here is to, really unpack how this condition, this simple chemical imbalance, affects two very different groups of animals. We've got the majestic camelid, so your camels, llamas, alpacas, and then the fascinating cervids, deer, elk, moose. We'll explore the universal mechanics behind it, but also some really startling differences in how they're vulnerable. You'll see how it can cause severe neurological problems, systemic issues, and, yeah, sadly, even death. And here's where it gets really interesting. You'd instinctively think, okay, dehydration, give water. But with salt poisoning, that can actually be the most dangerous step.
That's exactly right. At its very core, salt toxicosis is fundamentally a problem of water balance. It leads to something called hypernatremia, which is just a fancy way of saying there's too much sodium concentrated in the blood. And this imbalance, it typically happens through one of two main pathways. The first one is pretty straightforward. Excessive sodium intake, direct poisoning. This is when an animal just eats or drinks a whole lot of sodium chloride, salt, in a short time. Think about maybe an animal getting into free choice salt after they've been deprived for a while, or maybe improperly mixed feed that's way too salty, or even drinking really saline water like oil field brine, or even seawater in some situations. Okay, the second way, and this is actually often the more frequent scenario, is what we call water deprivation sodium ion intoxication, kind of indirect poisoning. Here, the issue isn't necessarily too much salt coming in, but rather not enough water. So maybe their water source freezes over, or an automatic water breaks, or there's just too many animals for the water available, or the water's frankly unpalatable. When that happens, the sodium that's normally in the body just gets more and more concentrated because the water volume is dropping. So calling it salt poisoning here is, well, sometimes a bit of a misnomer. The real failure is often just lack of access to water. But regardless of how it starts, the immediate effect is the same: hypernatremia. This high sodium level creates a really powerful osmotic gradient. It acts like a magnet, pulling water out of the body's cells. Water moves from the spaces between cells and from inside the cells themselves out into the bloodstream. This causes this sort of generalized cellular dehydration all over the body. And the central nervous system, the brain, and spinal cord is particularly sensitive to this. As water leaves the neurons, the brain cells, they literally shrink. And the shrinkage can cause the brain to pull away slightly inside the skull, potentially tearing tiny blood vessels. And it gets worse. Sodium ions can also diffuse, sort of passively move, into the cerebrospinal fluid and the brain tissue itself. Now, the brain does have ways to actively pump the sodium back out, but it's an energy-intensive process. And when the sodium concentration inside the brain cells gets too high, it actually shuts down or inhibits these pumps. So the sodium gets trapped inside the brain, keeping those brain cells hypertonic, concentrated and shrunken, even if the sodium level in the blood outside the brain starts to come down. This really sets the stage for the most dangerous part.
Okay, wait. That's completely counterintuitive. So after all that dehydration in the cells, you think water is the savior, right? Why on earth is giving water potentially fatal here? It sounds like the body's cure becomes the poison.
You've hit the nail on the head. That is the critical, often fatal event, the rehydration paradox. So imagine an animal that's been in this hypernatremic state for a while. Then suddenly they get access to unlimited fresh water. They're thirsty, right? So they drink a lot. Very quickly, this huge influx of water rapidly dilutes the sodium in their bloodstream. But remember, the brain cells are still full of that trapped sodium. And to make matters even trickier, during the dehydration phase, the brain cells actually produce other substances, we call them idiogenic osmoles, to try and pull some water back in and protect themselves. This adaptation, which helped them survive the dehydration, now makes the osmotic difference between the suddenly dilute blood and the still concentrated brain cells even more extreme. So water rushes along this massive gradient, flooding into the brain neurons. Yeah, they swell up dramatically. And inside the skull, there's no room for expansion. This leads to severe cerebral edema, brain swelling. Intracranial pressure skyrockets, the brain gets compressed. And that's when you see the sudden, severe clinical signs: violent seizures, coma, and very often death. That's exactly why rapid, uncontrolled rehydration is so incredibly dangerous in these cases.
That's genuinely astonishing. Okay, so let's pivot to camelids then. I mean, these are the animals famous for deserts, for handling salty conditions, right?
Oh,
They're the icons of arid environments.
yep.
So if they're so incredibly adapted,
Mhm.
how do they even fall victim to this? It feels like a massive contradiction.
It absolutely is a paradox, and understanding their adaptations is key. Camelids have this really extraordinary set of physiological tools for dealing with salt and water scarcity. Take their renal adaptations, their kidneys. They are unbelievably efficient at holding on to water and getting rid of excess salt. They can produce incredibly concentrated urine. Part of this is due to the kidney's internal structure, these very long loops of Henle, which are just fantastic at maximizing water reabsorption. They even upregulate specific genes, like one called SLC14A1, to help manage salt transport in the kidneys. It's quite remarkable. And then their hematological adaptations, their blood, they have these unique red blood cells. They're elliptical, not round, and they don't have a nucleus. And these cells are incredibly resistant to changes in osmotic pressure. They can swell up to something like 240% of their normal size in really dilute solutions without bursting.
Wow, 240%.
Yeah. It's a critical defense. It prevents massive hemolysis, red blood cell destruction, which can happen in other animals during rapid rehydration after they've been dehydrated. And finally, you have their dietary and behavioral adaptations. Dromedary camels, for instance, are well adapted to eat halophytes, salt-loving plants. And physiologically, their salt requirement is actually much higher than other livestock, maybe 6 to 8 times higher. They can tolerate drinking water with total soluble salt concentrations over 1.5% or 15,000 parts per million.
That's yeah.
Well, that's incredibly salty water for most mammals.
Okay, so they sound like they're practically built proof against this. Super kidneys, super blood cells, they even like salt more.
Yeah.
So how does mismanagement override all of that?
Yeah.
Where's the vulnerability?
Well, that's the crux of the paradox. Despite all these amazing natural defenses, salt toxicosis in camelids is almost exclusively a problem seen in domesticated or captive situations. It's very rare in the wild. It happens when their natural coping mechanisms are basically overwhelmed by acute mismanagement in an artificial setting. So the common scenarios. Things like water deprivation because an automatic waterer failed, or the water trough froze solid in winter, or just sheer neglect. Followed, crucially, by sudden unlimited access to fresh water later on. We also see it from mistakes in feed formulation, especially with milk replacers for baby camelids, Crius. If those aren't mixed exactly right, they can deliver a toxic sodium load. Same goes for improperly formulated concentrate feeds for adults. And sometimes, unfortunately, it's iatrogenic, meaning it's caused by veterinary treatment, like giving inappropriate oral or IV electrolyte solutions, especially to sick neonates. Crius are just so sensitive to fluid imbalances. Clinically, what you usually see are signs pointing straight to that brain swelling, the cerebral edema. So the animal might be depressed, lethargic, unsteady on its feet. That's ataxia. You might see head pressing, where they push their head against a wall or fence. Muscle tremors are common, sometimes severe spasms where they arch their head and neck back. That's called opisetanos, seizures, and eventually coma. One interesting finding, especially in the young ones, is often stress-induced hyperglycemia, high blood sugar. And you might see some GI signs too, like their first stomach compartment, the C1, slowing down. Diagnosing it usually involves putting together the history was there water restriction, a potential salt overdose with those neurological signs. But for a definitive diagnosis, you need blood work. You'll see markedly high serum sodium, often above 170 LAQL. And in neonates, you'll often see that high blood sugar and overall high blood osmolarity too. Treatment is absolutely an emergency. And the number one rule, the cardinal principle, is slow, controlled rehydration. You have to avoid that rapid fluid shift into the brain. The aim is to bring the serum sodium down very gradually, maybe no faster than about 0.5 to 1.0 mLQL per hour. This is usually done with intravenous fluids, specifically hypotonic ones like 0.45% saline or maybe 5% dextrose in water. And it's critical, especially for Crius, to avoid oral electrolyte solutions that are high in sodium. That just makes things worse. Supportive care might involve anticonvulsants if they're seizing, and maybe drugs like mannitol or corticosteroids to try and reduce brain swelling. But even with the best care, the prognosis is often guarded to poor. Mortality rates can easily exceed 50% in severe cases. It's really tough.
Okay, let's shift gears completely now. Let's talk about cervids deer, elk, moose. Because you mentioned this is a very different situation, often human-induced. It sounds like almost the reverse problem from the camelids.
It really is quite different, yeah. Cervids evolved mostly in temperate, inland areas where sodium is often naturally scarce, a limiting nutrient in the environment. So over time, they've developed this powerful innate physiological drive to seek out salt, a strong salt appetite. This craving usually peaks in spring and summer. That's when their diet is rich in new, lush vegetation, which is high in water and also high in potassium. And that high potassium intake actually makes it harder for their bodies to retain sodium, creating deficit. So this strong drive pushes them towards mineral licks, both natural ones and increasingly artificial ones.
Right, so they're biologically programmed to seek salt because it's usually rare.
Mhm.
So how are human activities taking that natural instinct and basically weaponizing it against them? What are these artificial sources?
We've inadvertently created these highly concentrated salt sources that act as uh, what biologists sometimes call supernormal stimuli. They're just irresistible. Probably the biggest one is road salt, the de-icing salt, mostly sodium chloride we use in winter. The runoff from salted roads creates these patches of highly saline soil and pools of salty water along roadsides. And these become major attractants for moose, elk, deer, they congregate there, which tragically leads directly to a huge increase in wildlife vehicle collisions. That's a massive source of mortality for these species in many areas. Then you also have agricultural and recreational salt licks. The salt or mineral blocks people put out. Farmers might use them for livestock, hunters might use them to attract game animals. And while the intention might be good, sometimes they can become lethal traps. If there isn't a good water source nearby, or if animals that have been deprived find them and just gorge themselves, you can get acute toxicosis. Now, because these are wild animals, we rarely get to observe the clinical signs of salt poisoning directly. Usually, the animals are just found dead, often near one of these salt sources. If someone does see an affected animal, the signs are what you'd expect from brain dysfunction. Staggering, maybe walking in circles, appearing blind, weakness, sometimes seizures. Diagnosing it after death, post-mortem, can be tricky too because the physical findings aren't always obvious or specific. A necropsy might show some mild stomach irritation. Maybe the gut contents look unusually dry. You might see signs of brain swelling, like the folds on the brain surface looking flattened. But really, for a definitive diagnosis, you need toxicology on brain tissue or the cerebrospinal fluid. Finding sodium levels over, say, 2,000 parts per million in the brain is pretty strong evidence for salt toxicosis. But here's where it gets even more complex and, frankly, concerning. These salt sources create a compounded risk. They become what we call an ecological trap. It's not just the direct risk of poisoning or getting hit by a car, it's also about disease transmission. When you have high densities of animals gathering repeatedly at these licks, it's the perfect setup for spreading pathogens.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, through direct nose-to-nose contact or indirectly through contaminated soil, saliva, urine, feces building up where they lick. And this is a huge concern, particularly with chronic wasting disease, CWD. That's that fatal prion disease similar to mad cow affecting deer, elk, moose. The prions that cause CWD are shed by infected animals, and they're incredibly persistent in the environment, especially in soil. Research has actually confirmed that the soil at these mineral licks can act as reservoirs for CWD prions. So these licks become critical hotspots for transmitting and amplifying the disease within the population. We've also seen it facilitate other things like parasite spillover. There was a case in Norway with a nasty nematode worm jumping from domestic sheep to wild reindeer, largely because they were sharing salt licks. So putting out salt licks, even with the best intentions of helping wildlife, can be really counterproductive. You risk causing acute poisoning, yes, but you also risk creating these focal points for infectious diseases that can have devastating impacts on the whole population. It's why some places, like Washington State, have actually banned providing salt licks and feeding deer and elk specifically to try and slow down CWD spread.
Wow. Okay, so we really do have two incredibly distinct pictures here. Camelids, adapted for salt, poisoned by mismanagement and captivity. Cervids, driven to seek scarce salt, poisoned by an excess created by us, and then facing disease risks at those same spots. So pulling this all together, what does this mean for prevention? There's no single answer.
Exactly. Prevention has to be tailored completely differently for each group, addressing their specific physiology and the context of the risk. Just to quickly recap the contrast, camelids, you could say, are physiologically water independent and salt tolerant. Their problem is almost always acute mismanagement in an artificial, human-controlled environment. So we see clinical cases diagnosed by vets before death, usually. Cervids, on the other hand, are water-dependent and salt-seeking. Their innate biology, that drive for salt, is dangerously exploited by anthropogenic, human-made salt sources littering their natural environment. This often leads to unwitnessed deaths, diagnosed after the fact by wildlife pathologists, and creates those disease hotspots. So for camelid husbandry, prevention is all about rigorous day-to-day care and smart clinical management. Number one is water management. Constant, unrestricted access to clean, fresh, palatable water. That means daily checks of waters, making sure nothing's broken, nothing's frozen in cold weather. It sounds basic, but it's critical. Then, feed and mineral management, being incredibly precise when mixing commercial feeds, especially milk replacers. If you ever use salt to limit feed intake, which is sometimes done, it has to be introduced very slowly, with absolutely guaranteed water access at all times. And clinically, vets need to be super vigilant. Think about hypernatremia in any camelid that's sick or dehydrated. And if fluid therapy is needed, remember, slow, cautious correction of that water deficit, constantly monitoring electrolytes. Now, for cervids and wildlife management, the approach is much broader, focusing on the environment and public policy. Road salt mitigation is a big one. Can we explore less toxic alternatives for de-icing? Can we use engineering, like better drainage, to stop those salty pools from forming along roadsides? And definitely more wildlife warning signs. Regulation of artificial salt licks is key. Wildlife agencies really need to strongly discourage, or maybe even prohibit, putting them out to attract wildlife, particularly in areas where CWD is a concern because of that disease risk. And finally, public education. Making sure landowners, hunters, the general public understand the dual dangers here. Not just the direct poisoning risk from salt blocks, but also how they create these disease traps that ultimately harm the wildlife populations they might be trying to help.
It's really a stark reminder, isn't it? How tightly linked physiology, the environment we shape, and our own actions are. For camelids, salt poisoning is this tragic outcome of human error in a setting we control. But for cervids, it's become this complex environmental and epidemiological challenge, where a behavior that helped them survive is now a dangerous trap because of how we've changed the landscape.
Absolutely. And understanding these nuances, these differences, is just crucial. Whether you're a vet, a wildlife manager, a researcher, or even just someone who cares about animal welfare or conservation, it's only by understanding the specific context that we can actually develop strategies that work to prevent this and protect these animals.
So, maybe something to think about as you go about your day. Consider those unseen ripple effects of what seem like small human actions. Salting a road in winter, putting out a mineral block for deer. How might these things be impacting the intricate web of life around us in ways we don't immediately see? That makes you wonder, what other seemingly minor changes are we making to our environment that might be creating these hidden ecological traps for the wildlife we share the planet with?